This is Kurtzburn Publishing. My name is Vincent Gillen and I welcome you to Somme Stories Inverclyde. A brief look at the Battle of the Somme, which took place from July the 1st till November the 18th, 1916, and its connections with Inverclyde. We will look at some of the local people and units that were involved. The Somme is a river in the north of France, and the names of the villages and woods in this area have become infamous over the years as representing scenes of unbelievable casualties. More than 3 million soldiers fought here, with 1/3 becoming casualties. It was one of the deadliest battles of all time and has stayed in the public conscience for over a century now. The battle was seen as being such a momentous shift in the war that virtual live reporting was made in the form of a film that would be shown in all the local cinemas. This advert is for the Greenock Picture House, later on the Gaumont. This in turn was used by the filmmaker Peter Jackson in 2018 to produce a colorised updated version. The battle, however, was not the success it was hoped to be, despite Lloyd George's hope that if the exhibition of this picture all over the world does not end war, God help civilization. The Battle of the Somme. This is an article in the Port Glasgow Express by a Port Canadian who's in it. While the people of Port Glasgow were privileged to witness in the Palace and Eclipse Picture Houses this week some phases of the Battle of the Somme, it is interesting to have some little description of it by a Port Glasgow boy who went out to Canada and who came back again over the pond to fight for the dear old homeland. Here is how he writes. France, October the 11th, 1916. Dear Editor, someplace is a Canadian phrase for the Somme district. The gates of Gehenna is Welsh, as per Lloyd George. Maybe it would interest you to have a Port Glasgow opinion of that valley of death as seen by a Port Glasgow boy. Of course, there is not much interesting work making an advance with tons of shrapnel bursting around you. Still, you feel contented to hear our guns giving them 10-1, a big change from Ypres. We had a big row out here lately. My mate suggested that we send for the police, but as we have learned to do without them, it passed as a joke. We advanced on Courlette village, which has a wall or two left yet. By the way, we had a couple of tanks with us that did as much work as any regiment. Since 1st of July, we have advanced 7 miles on a 9-mile front, taking 200 prisoners per mile. Of killed and wounded, I should like to forget about that, but I saw more Germans dead than ours. The taking of Courlette was allotted to us. We took it all right. Also, we captured a German baron who did not want to walk with an ordinary British soldier. He did not either. We carried him down on a stretcher. On the road back, I got wounded with gas shell shrapnel and lay 48 hours in a shell hole or another, passing 2 nights in what I call hell, with shells bursting all around and waiting for death at any minute. One's nerves gets affected, especially when one finds one cannot walk, only wriggle about under excessive pain. Didn't I carry that baron? Finally I got picked up by a fellow who told me to never mind as we had a good navy. My opinion is we'll win, but I wouldn't live here after the war for no price. Uncle Sam, I did not raise my boy to be a soldier, I raised him up to be my pride and joy. Who dares to place a musket on his shoulder to kill some other mother's darling's boy? Kaiser Bill. Go away, your boy would never make a soldier, he wouldn't make an imitation toy. He'd sooner grab another fellow's dollar, would your nabbing grabbing Yankee Doodle boy. Scots were heavily involved in the Battle of the Somme and suffered heavy casualties as a result. Scots battalions were often used as impact units in the first wave of attacks. Between the 1st of July and the 18th of November, 288 men from Inverclyde were killed. These are the names of the Inverclyde men who died on the first day of the battle on the 1st of July. Also, here are some of the photographs of these men and the newspaper articles or intimations that were made. Three Scottish divisions were involved: the 9th, the 15th and the 51st Highland. 51 Scottish battalions took part in the Somme offensive at some time. The author Ian Hay wrote, "For nearly 2 years the British armies on the Western Front have been playing for time. They have been sticking their toes in and holding their ground, with numerically inferior forces and inadequate artillery support, against a nation in arms which has set out, with 40 years of preparation at its back, to sweep the earth. We have held them, and now their tag has come for us. The deal has passed into our hand at last. A fortnight ago, ready for the first time to undertake the offensive on a grand and prolonged scale, Lewes was a mere reconnaissance compared with this, the new British Army went over the parapet shoulder to shoulder with the most heroic army in the world, the Army of France, and attacked over a 16-mile front in the valley of the Somme. We, looking back now over a space of 12 months, know how our boys answered that question. In the greatest and longest battle that the world had yet seen, that army of city clerks, Midland farm lads, Lancashire mill hands, Scottish miners and Irish corner boys, side by side with their great-hearted brethren from overseas, stormed positions which had been held impregnable for 2 years, captured 70,000 prisoners, reclaimed several hundred square miles of the sacred soil of France, and smashed once and for all the German-fostered fable of the invincibility of the German army. It was good to have lived and suffered during those early and lean years, if only to be present at their fulfilment." Of course, this positive view wasn't exactly the outcome of the battle, and war would continue for another 2 years. Here are a few brief profiles of local casualties. William Lisle was the grandson of Abram Lisle, son of William Park Lisle. Lieutenant Colonel William Lisle was one of the most senior British officers killed on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. He was commanding the 23rd Battalion Northumberland Fusiliers, the 4th Tyneside Scottish, which suffered 686 casualties that day. Part of the 34th Division, Lisle's battalion had the objective of La Boisselle village and had to cross around 500 yards of open ground that was covered by largely intact German machine gun positions. Advancing at a walk towards largely uncut wire, the Tynesiders were mown down. Lisle presumably set off at their head and rapidly became one of the casualties. A large Celtic-style cross in Hampstead Cemetery, London, commemorates Lieutenant Colonel Lisle's mother Jane, his father, and himself. The family was one half of Tate and Lyle Sugar. The body of Lieutenant Colonel Lisle was found by the Divisional Commander Major General Angeville Williams on the 13th of July. The General wrote to his wife, "I have just been reconnoitring and found poor Colonel Lisle's body surrounded by Tyneside Scottish, Northumberland Fusiliers. All dead, a most grievous sight to me who loved my faithful soldiers." This is an image of William Lisle in the centre with the officers of his battalion. This is a picture of Tom Dunsmore. and this is taken from the Port Glasgow Express. On the eve of the Great Push on the 1st of July, a number of the port boys of the HLI met and conversed with each other. They knew what was to happen on the morrow. They knew that few would part where many met, but there was not one amongst them dismayed. The day had come when Hun must be rolled back towards the Rhine, and they were going to be in the big push, do or die. And they did their bit, each boy among them. The Highland Light Infantry were in the forefront, and they bore themselves with all the dash and gallantry of the regular British soldiers. Among that band was Private Thomas Dunsmore, eldest son of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Dunsmore, Mary Street. No boy wrote more regularly home than did Tom Dunsmore, and there was an ominous silence for some days. On Friday morning, official intimation was received that he was amongst the missing. He enlisted 2 years ago in the commercial battalion of the HLI and trained at Gales. He went over the parapet that fateful morning of the 1st of July to meet in deadly conflict the opposing hosts of Germans. Fast fell the gallant lads of the HLI, but when that onslaught was finished for the day, Tom Dunsmore was one of the few who went through without a scratch. He wrote home regularly up until the 13th of July, and the official communication states that he's been missing since the 14th of July. Among the boys he met on the eve of the great event in the world's history was John Buchanan, also since reported among the missing, and James Duguid and Duncan MacFarlane, all of the same regiment. There is, of course, the remote possibility that these Port Glasgow boys reported missing may be prisoners in the hands of the Germans. Private Archie Dunsmore, the youngest of the family, was also in that big event. He was one of the 5 lads from the staff of the Gourock Ropework Company who enlisted in the commercial battalion of the 17th HLI. He was picked along with James Hurd to serve in the machine gun section, and they are still both in the trenches, fit and well. This memorial stone in Greenock Cemetery is for Andrew Goldie Dunsmuir, who fell in action at the Somme on the 1st of July. This is one of the few stones in the cemetery that actually mention the place name Somme. This is another fine memorial stone in Greenock Cemetery to James Blair Walmsley, who died at the Somme on the 8th of August. The family lived at 30 South Street, and his brother was a professor of anatomy at Glasgow. The newspaper report entitled "A Most Gallant Officer." Mrs. Walmsley, South Street, has received some news of the death of her son, Mr. James Walmsley, 2nd Lieutenant, 8th Battalion, King's Own Scottish Borderers, which took place on the 8th of August. Son of a father who had a long and gallant career in the Indian Marine, he had, on the outbreak of war, no hesitation as to where his duty lay, and in September 1914 he enlisted as a private in the Scots Guards. After a period of training, he was sent to the front in January 1915 and was in most of the fighting thereafter, and as one of a bombing section he had some narrow escapes. In the great attempt at Lewes he was wounded. His bravery in action, however, had come under the observation of his officers, and he was appointed to a cadet school in France in March 1916. In April he received his commission in the 8th King's Own Scottish Borderers, and after a few days at home he returned to the front. Since then he has been almost constantly engaged. The letter from his commanding officer announcing his death to his mother bears testimony to his gallantry. "I much regret to have to announce to you," he says, "the death of your son, who has been in my regiment since April. He was killed instantaneously by rifle shots when emerging from the trench to proceed on patrol last night. We all much regret the loss of a most gallant officer who has proved himself an excellent soldier, especially on the 14th of May and on several subsequent occasions. The life for him has been rough, on one occasion buried and shocked by shell, but he has been ever eager for the work." Another newspaper cutting showing prisoners of war taken at the Battle of the Somme on the 14th of July. The man on the right is Private T. McPhail, whose mother resides at 2 Carchburn Street. When you Google the term Somme and photographs, this is one of the pictures that come up which show quite clearly what it was like in a trench at that time. One man on guard looking very exhausted and the other sleeping. This is a letter from a chum. Dear Mrs. Henderson, just a line to let you know that Dick was killed on the 22nd of this month. It was at the Somme and we were just getting into a trench when a shell burst and killed poor Dick and another chap. It seems very hard lines on us after sticking it together for 18 months and then getting killed when the end of this war became very near. I saw him buried as decently as we could and marked his grave with his name and number and put a cross on his grave. We buried him where he fell. The whole of the battalion felt sorry, for he was a great favourite with the whole of them. Please accept the sympathy of the whole of the company and myself, from his affectionate chum, L. Shearer. This was Private Richard W. Henderson of the 11th Royal Scots, who was killed at the Somme, aged 27. And art thou dead, my dear son, art thou dead? Thy mother's tears can't raise thy fallen head. Peace to the spotless shade in quiet rest. Why should I mourn since thou art ever blessed? Farewell, dear Dick, to my heart so dear. Oft in the silent night I bathe thy memory with a tear. Inserted by his sorrowing mother at 7A George Street. Another Greenock man killed at the Somme was Charles Mill Nichol, Assistant Director of Medical Services in the 3rd Division. He had lost his brother at Gallipoli the year before. His diaries are in archives in Leeds, and this extract on the right shows his diary entry for the 22nd of October 1916. The day before he died. This is the Nichol family gravestone at Greenock Cemetery. The Clyde Royal Garrison Artillery was a territorial unit with their headquarters in King Street, Port Glasgow. At the outbreak of war in 1914 there were 3 garrison companies: number 1 Port Glasgow, number 2 Helensburgh and Dumbarton, and number 3 Dumbarton. They had units at Fort Matilda and the Clough. In autumn 1914, Fort Matilda was manned by the 2-1 Company of the Clyde Royal Garrison Artillery, led by James Lithgow of shipbuilding fame and his cousin John Birkmeyer. The men of the Clyde RGA were fit and powerfully built, a necessity because of the need to handle the heavy ordnance that was associated with static defences. Early in the war, many members of the garrisons volunteered for foreign service, and by 1915 replacements had been recruited and trained. Significant numbers of these replacements also volunteered for service abroad. Because of these pressures, recruitment to the Clyde RGA was extended by April 1916 to include men in the age range of 41 to 47, who were considered unfit for general or overseas service. By August, with conscription now in force, the War Office was stressing the urgent necessity of finding suitable candidates for commissions in the Clyde RGA, and among those whose names were put forward were gunners, privates and cadets. In addition to recruitment problems, both Portkill and Fort Matilda were now feeling the effects of another factor in the equation. With the installation of an anti-submarine boom across the estuary in 1915-16, stretching from Dunoon to Clough Point, the emphasis on static marine defences now switched further downriver. Portkill lost 2 of its most powerful guns to the new battery at Clough Point in October 1916, and Fort Matilda likewise had 2 guns redeployed elsewhere in February 1917. As the war went on, there was a need for a higher trajectory gun, so instead of field artillery, the use of howitzers became necessary, and so the men who were in the RGA were efficient in this and were sent abroad. These are pictures of the Clyde RGA at the Clough Road, doing their marches, I presume. Also at Fort Matilda. On the Lisle Hill, you can see the Battery Park in the background and the hills beyond. They were stationed up there on garrison duty. This chart shows the locations and area, arcs of fire and arc of illumination of the 4 batteries in the mid and upper reaches of the Clyde estuary, and the arcs of illumination of the Dunoon DELs in January 1917. Of course, the Clough Caravan Park is now the site of where these men were based for the guns and the searchlights. And so Lithgow and many of his men were first away. They joined the 40th Siege Battery and went out to the Western Front on the 28th of February 1916, armed with 4 6-inch howitzers, and joined the 34th Heavy Artillery Brigade on the 6th of March 1916. Lithgow wrote, "Rather more than half of the territorial force are with me, and we have joined up with half of another battery. I am in charge. We had a hell of a time getting here, all night travelling, day reconnoitring, all night getting our stuff into position, up a road like from Ormsbury House to halfway from the bridge to the Fank. Lorries could not touch it, so we had horses and men. We were ready with all guns by daylight and kept firing away all day, also the next and through the following night. We have now had a peaceful day and night, and up to now it is quiet, but we rather expect Fritz to hit back. We got nothing much near us, and really the show was quite magnificent, the whole valley in the dark being often so lighted by flashes as to let you see your way perfectly. We have still a lot to do, digging holes for ourselves and clearing out old chalk pits in the face of the hill for protection. I have now got a tin shanty close into the hill and hope to have a real earth by tomorrow, which will be quite safe. There is not a house for miles. In good weather it is quite all right." Lithgow was deeply concerned for his men. His deerstalker's skill in making use of cover had helped him to train them in a way that prevented many casualties. He used a shipyard technique to cover his guns with camouflage, which could be hauled away by ropes as soon as action sounded, and replaced as quickly by a counter haul. But he could not conceal his tears when the first gunners of his battery fell. The comradeship of those he had known in Port Glasgow or its neighbourhood meant a great deal to him. A wounded signaller, whose deeds earned him the DCM, could not be traced for a while after he was sent back for treatment, and his commander spent anxious hours searching for him on the lines of communication when the battle slackened. When an invalided officer returned, he showed his pleasure in a letter to his brother. "He is so cheery and so un-English, which is a relief." A staff sergeant, who afterwards made his career in the Lithgow yards, gave us a picture of the man. "There were just our lads there, and one fellow with a clarinet, and all of us singing, and Major Lithgow sitting cross-legged over a barrel of beer, conducting the proceedings with a pig's trotter. We were all calling for our favourite tunes, and then somebody shouted, 'Come on, sir, what's your favourite?' The Major hesitated, and while he was making up his mind, a lad at the back imitated his voice and shouted, 'Get on with the work!' George Mallory, the famous climber, served with Lithgow in the 40th from May 1916 for a year. His best friends were Robert Graves and Rupert Brooke. Mallory was assigned to the battery then in position in the northern sector on the Western Front. That summer he took part in the Somme offensive. He wrote to his wife about the bombardment that took place before the infantry attack. "It was very noisy, field batteries again firing over our heads, Of course, there are plenty in front of us too. And most annoying of them, a 60-pounder, which has a nasty trick of blowing out the lamp with its vigorous blast. Later that month, George Mallory saw flamethrowers in action for the first time. He described how he saw a sort of liquid fire, a long line of trenches apparently on fire and exploding with great flashes and clouds of sparks. On the 15th of August 1916, he wrote about the large number of people killed during the Somme offensive. I don't object to corpses so long as they are fresh. With the wounded, it is different. It always distresses me to see them. Mallory was constantly worried about the dangers of killing his own men. He wrote in a letter to his wife about this fear. Before I went to sleep, I heard distinctly from the murmur of voices in the tent some mentions of our troops being shelled out of a trench by our own guns. I can't tell you what a miserable time I had after that. You see, if my registration had been untrue, it was my fault. I went over and over again in my mind all the circumstantial evidence that it was really our shells I had seen bursting, and had horrible doubts and fears. The surroundings are indescribably desolate and dotted with small crosses. We haven't many dead in the trenches, at least only one decapitated unfortunate has been discovered below the surface, but those outside could well do with some loose earth over them. Here we have the Greenock-based 3rd Highland Howitzers. The 3rd Highland Howitzer Brigade of the Royal Field Artillery served as divisional artillery with the 51st Highland Division. The Highland Division was created in 1908 as part of the Territorial Force. They had just departed for annual camp when they were recalled to home base. They mobilised for full-time war service on the 5th of August 1914 and concentrated at Bedford, commanded by Peter C. McFarlane, the son of the shipowner Captain Peter McFarlane of Glencloone, Port Glasgow, in partnership with John Burkmeyer in Lyle Shipping. Several units were sent to France as reinforcements for the British Expeditionary Force between November 14 and March 1915. The rest of the division proceeded to France in early May 1915. The division concentrated in the area of Lille, Boone and Robec and were rushed to the defence of Ypres, being in action until the 19th of May when they moved to Esther on the River Lys. They were in action in the Battle of Festubert and the second action of Givenchy before moving south to the Somme, taking over the line near Hamel. In 1916 they were in action in the battles of the Somme, including the attacks on Highwood. The RFA Highland Howitzers were broken up on the 21st of August 1916 due to casualties. And this is a newspaper report of the howitzers heading to Bedford. Scott and McIntyre, the horse purchase officers, went off by motor to Kilmarnock, but were a bit late for Aird's horses as the best were gone. They bought 7 teams and riders. Among the latter was one old friend, Mysterious Mitch. He looks desperately thin and poor. He has been a willing slave to Aird, and I hope we will be able to give him a better life of it. It takes the horse purchase officers some hours to realise their powers. It's a hard job. For the whole brigade we have to find nearly 400 horses. At the moment it hardly seems possible. The hire purchase officers are most energetic. Peter McFarlane writes from the Greenock Club on the 4th of August 1914. After 5 days of suspense, I received orders today to mobilise. I am thankful that something has happened, as I was itching to do something. Do not worry, we will only be used to garrison the country when the regular soldiers go off. We may not go further away than Perth. It is our first station, and if we are there, I shall see my loved ones sometime. I am thankful to be in the position I am in. The non-soldiers are feeling a bit uncomfortable now, I guess. Every man should be a soldier. You will be quite proud to be able to talk about your hubby, the Colonel, being ordered out with his brigade. We go into uniform tomorrow and remain in it until disbanded. No swagger blue uniform or service dress only. Peter McFarlane talks about what many of us might recognise today. Worse, it is rather discouraging when one is working hard and doing one's best with the government supplying nothing to do it with. I am mad with everyone. The waste is awful as a rule. I had to buy 100 weight of whitewash today as the government could not supply it. It cost me 2 shillings and 6pence. There are some absolute fools on the staff. Here's a sample. In order to economise on horses, you will return your 2-horse lorries and receive instead of each lorry a 1-horse 2-wheeled cart. I pointed out that according to the government scale, the lorry carried 30 hundredweight and the cart 13. Therefore, we would require more horses than ever. They have admitted their error and dropped the great scheme. Fools, all of them. This newspaper clipping certainly shows that sport was an important factor. Important in keeping up morale and helped with fitness, and certainly proved very competitive. The Howitzers certainly seem to have put out some very good teams at this time. This is a picture of Mr. John Lang of Port Glasgow, who was with the RGA. He was a long-standing member and would continue to serve in the territorial forces after the war. In a letter to the Telegraph in June 1915, a correspondent writes, "To add to our comforts we have rigged up what we term shacks. No, we don't sleep under hedges. Composed of waterproof sheets and supported by short poles driven into the ground. This arrangement constitutes our sleeping quarters and affords us every comfort. I promised to give you an account of how a bombardment is carried out, but as censorship rules forbid too much publicity to this article, I am obliged to considerably curtail it. At any rate, I shall endeavour to give your readers an idea of what it feels like to take part in one. The first intimation of the start of a bombardment is the loud reports of a shell being fired in the distance. Soon other batteries take up the call until the ground under our feet trembles with vibrations. In a very short time, countless numbers of shells are screeching through the air, while lurid flashes jut out from all parts of the front. A most entrancing sight. The continual rumble echoing throughout the night air like thunder rolling in the heavens and creating a very weird impression on all concerned. The heavy strain on officers and men at this time can be well imagined, when we take into consideration the amount of labour that is attached to it, and the anxiety of all concerned to give of their best. Then again, the loud reports from each gun have to be contended with, which deafens the men in a very short time. But these discomforts are of very little concern. If the bombardment has been successful and their object attained, they know their energy has been well spent, and are proud of the fact that they were able to do their bit, and to still further prove the true spirit of the British bulldog. During the intervals in the firing, the sound of the infantry's rifles drift to our ears, while countless star shells dispel the gloom of the night, but only for an instant. Like the flicker of a match, they die out, and darkness again envelops the front. We men in the wagon line are silent watchers, and the thought goes through our mind, what a grim business is warfare. This notification of the death of Gunner Tanner of the Howitzer Brigade. Word has been received of the death of a member of the Howitzer Brigade, Gunner William S. Tanner of 3 Maryfield Terrace, who was killed in action on the 12th of November through gas poisoning. 2 of his brothers are serving with the colours. In a letter to his father, Gunner Tanner's captain writes, "The shell burst just outside the dugout in which he and 3 others were sleeping, and he had not sufficient time to put on his respirator before the gas took effect. He was unconscious for about 2 hours before he died. He was a gallant lad, always ready and willing to do his duty at any time, and I regret his death very much indeed. He died at his post, and you should be proud of your son." A lieutenant writes, Your son was one of the most popular men in the battery, and his many friends all feel deeply the loss which we suffer with you. As a gunner, no man was more valued, nor did better work with the gun he served so long and so well. His death, just at the time when we have gained such a brilliant victory, has been keenly felt by us all. Peter McFarlane writes about other casualties. Sad about Douglas being killed. Wilson tells me it is the first break in the Douglas family. They were very proud of him and will be much cut up. Willock had 9 men buried by a shell yesterday, all unhurt except the sergeant major whose head was cut. I see Blair is in the casualty list today. I hope he goes on well. At one time it was thought he might lose his hand. His middle finger will always be shorter. He had a very narrow escape and I do not think he will be fit for a long time. Here there is talk about more reconstruction and I do not know but at that I shall find another change coming on for myself. The casualty lists are a bit big at present. It has been tough work on the Somme evidently. Again, Peter McFarlane writes, Nell, dear, we have had some very heavy rain and our poor horses are deep in the mud. I wish it would clear up properly. The General asked me to lunch today. Very good lunch. He is very serious and rarely if ever smiles. Morton's lot seem to have got it badly. I have a corporal in my Highlanders whose twin brother is missing. It is awful, but must be got through. I wish Turkey and Austria would chuck it up and allow the Boche to get the full blow. Another local casualty with the Highland Howitzers was Tom Hiddleston, who died on the 28th of August 1916. Mrs. Hiddleston of 9 Prospect Hill Street has been officially notified that her son, gunner Tom Hiddleston, has died of wounds in France. Prior to enlistment, he was employed as a plater with Messrs. Dunlop, Bremner and Company. On the right is his great-great-nephew, the actor Tom Hiddleston. Peter McFarlane again. Got to bed after 2 AM and was wakened properly at 6 AM by the Boche shelling vigorously. People at home seem to think that the Boche is on the point of chucking the game. We find him distinctly hostile and active with plenty of ammunition too. Our old division has a good name. One fine regular division is said to call it our territorial division. 4 weeks rest in nearly 15 months is a record in itself. I am very sorry for our infantry who have done wonderful work that other divisions could not perform. It makes me hot to hear how others are rested and pampered. I wish you saw the decoration ribbons worn in other divisions. It seems to be the exception to have none. Graham and Wilson are out at present on the beastly job of mending telephone wires which have been broken by shell fire. I am always glad to see them return safely. Leave is quite out of the question, dear, so we must give up hope of any coming on for some time. In a letter in December 1915, just a few lines hoping that you'll find a space in your paper thanking all the friends and people of the good old Port Glasgow Parish Church Working Party for sending the 1st 3rd Highland Howitzer Brigade sweets and socks and lots of other things, as we are all doing well and happy somewhere in France. And I think we are doing our bit in crushing the Germans. We are trying to finish the war sometime before the month of March. All the boys are giving their best respects to the people of Port Glasgow for the prime presents, hoping you will give the 3rd Highland Howitzer Brigade the best of luck in your next paper sent out here. We have been doing well since we left Greenock and also since we left Bedford 8 months ago, hoping to still do better till it is all over. All the Greenock and district lads are always glad to hear the news about the port. When they see the express, they know you are all well in the good old port all this time. Peter McFarlane on the 27th of July 1916. So sorry about these scrappy postcards, but I really am in such an awful position that I can hardly get them off to you at times. I have not seen a newspaper for nearly a week. This is my record of discomfort. Thursday night I did not have my clothes off but got a night's sleep. On Tuesday, no clothes off again, gas shells all night. Wednesday, more gas shells all night but sleeping in pyjamas. The gas is awful and wearing that beastly helmet is disgusting. You dare not sleep in gas, so for 2 nights we have had to sit round keeping one another awake. You can imagine our tempers. I have never missed 2 nights sleep in succession before today, and I feel pretty awful. I wonder how the war goes. Our bit is a tough job. Our infantry are really grand. I wonder when they are to have a rest. We want one too badly. Poor old Highland Division, 4 weeks in 1 year. It is rather a strain, and I'm not quite so bad as the others, because I did get back for a week. This has been the longest week I have ever known, I think, dear. We've been 5 days here, and it feels like a year. And so we have seen Peter McFarlane in his letters talking about gas, and so on the 7th of August, on the 4th of August, it was reported that he was admitted to the 14th General Hospital in Wimereux, suffering from gas poisoning, severe. And so we move on to the 51st Highland Division. This is Kenneth MacDonald, who was with the 8th Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, and he was killed in November 1916. His father put together a booklet of poems that he'd written, and one of them was about the Highland Howitzers. Howitzers, fare ye well, good luck be ever thine, your duty do, be staunch and true, though thin but steady line. Howitzers, fare ye well. Howitzers, fare ye well, chivalry ne'er forget, honour woo and never do a deed you would regret. Howitzers, fare ye well. Howitzers, fare ye well, banish every fear, and in the fight don't lose sight of ones who love you dear. Howitzers, fare ye well. Howitzers, fare ye well, your orders are obey, do or die, don't ask why, yours is to win the day. Howitzers, fare ye well. Howitzers, fare ye well, downhearted never be, when things go wrong just plod along, at home or cross the sea. Howitzers, fare ye well. This is a memorial stone, one of 2 in Greenock Cemetery, to Kenneth MacDonald. One, he's remembered basically on 2 of his family's stones. Next up, involved in the Somme were the Ansons, a battalion of the Royal Naval Division, with a majority of local men among their numbers. Churchill decided to make many of the sailors into land-based units because basically there weren't enough ships available for them to serve on. They had originally fought in Antwerp at the start of the war, and then in Gallipoli before moving to the Western Front. This is a picture prior to them leaving for the war at Seafield House on the Esplanade, which was their headquarters. This image shows the Seafield lads, as they were known, at a display, I think, in Dunoon or possibly Rothesay. It is quite sobering to see these faces and the ones in the following slide, and consider the fact that they faced death just a few years after this. Captain McCurdy, standing on the left, lost his life at Gallipoli. The lad standing beside the older officer in the middle of the back row is John Evans, who won a DCM at Gallipoli. This great image shows the Seafield lads, or as they captioned it on the back of the postcard, the Seafield Canuts, a term for a bunch of likely lads having a good time. It shows them in a far more relaxed atmosphere, and the John Evans that we mentioned in the previous slide is second from the left. The Royal Naval Division was split into 2 brigades, each with 4 battalions. The ensigns were mostly made up of men from the Clyde Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, including the Seafield lads from Greenock, Gourock, Port Glasgow and surrounding villages. The ensigns were first in action in Antwerp, for which they were hopelessly unprepared. They were quickly withdrawn and eventually were sent to Gallipoli and then to the Western Front. On the bottom left is the commemoration and in memoriam of the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserves, the Clyde Division, Greenock companies of the A Company Ensign Battalion, who landed at Cape Helles, Gallipoli on the 25th of April 1915, and dedicated to the memory of the brave Lieutenant Commander Peter McCurdy, Lieutenant Brown, 2 petty officers, 3 leading men and 10 able seamen who lost their lives. Also 9 able bodies lost on HMS Victor. So this was the toll taken on by the local RNVR. After Gallipoli, some of the men were sent back on board ships, but others, in May 1916, found themselves fighting in the trenches of the Western Front, in the final phase of the Battle of the Somme, advancing along the River Ancre to capture Beaucourt. 33 local Royal Naval Division men died as a result of the fighting at Gallipoli, and another 30 were killed here, whereas over the course of the war some 60 RNVR men lost their lives at sea. As you can see by the cartoon, it was rather damp at the Somme. Here on the left is a memorial card presented to local man Thomas Duffy of the Ensign Battalion, detailing the battles that the RND fought in. In closing this talk, I will leave you with a poem written by A.P. Herbert, who wrote about one of their generals, Cameron Shute. The general inspecting the trenches exclaimed with a horrified shout, "I refuse to command a division which leaves its excreta about." But nobody took any notice. No one was prepared to refute that the presence of shit was congenial compared to the presence of shoot. And certain responsible critics made haste to reply to his words, observing that his staff advisors consisted entirely of turds. For shit may be shot at odd corners, and paper supplied there to suit, but a shit would be shot without mourners if somebody shot that shit shoot. It's easy for me to say. Thank you for listening to Somme Stories Inverclyde. I hope you have enjoyed the talk.